So, welcome to this week's Smart QA Musings, which is a gentle flurry of interesting thoughts. And today's one, another hopefully an interesting one, a subject that I deeply love. One is philosophy, and of course, second is testing and assurance. So, I think the whole thing, this particular musing is about philosophy and smart assurance, and what could be timeless wisdom for modern QA from some of the wonderful philosophers of yore. Just to set the context, philosophy can mean very many things. It probably sometimes seems very abstract to most of us. It comes from two words of Greek words, philo, which is love, and sophos, which is wisdom. Right? So it's basically the love for wisdom. And therefore it simply means it's a study of proper behavior and search for wisdom. And of course, when he says behavior and wisdom, what does it mean? It's a rational investigations of questioning. So philosophy is truly asking questions about existence, about knowledge, about ethics, and so on. So it's probably the most deep form of knowledge because you're examining at the lowest level very deeply. And all you're examining is by questions. And quite sure, as smart assurance folks, smart testers, that's what we do for a living, question. And in the process, maybe uncover some interesting issues, suggestions, ideas, and so on and so forth. Okay? So that to me is the deep connection between the notion of philosophy and assurance. So there are many great thinkers of philosophy. They go back beyond, from the BC onwards, all the way up to the modern age. And there is a whole bunch of greatest thinkers who can possibly teach us something about how we can test. We will talk about 10 plus people here, some of which are listed, here in the first sheet. I've not put all the 11 people here. Some are from Greek philosophers, some are European philosophers, some are American, and so on and so forth. But it's nothing to do with the nationality. We start with Socrates, Aristotle, Sun Tzu, and even Einstein, though we know him as a scientist. And we try to relate what it means to the act of coding, to the act of automation, to act of report, general context of assurance at large. That's really what it is. So what do history's greatest thinkers, what can they teach us? What do they teach us? How can we relate to our field of testing and make it smarter? So when you look at philosophy and you're trying to correlate it with respect to QA, you might think of it as three intersecting circles. Philosophy, which to a large degree is about thinking, the act of asking questions. The logic, which we all understand as the notion of science, the ability to rationally analyze, find out solutions, which is science, which fundamentally means there is hypothesis and proof. Either prove something or disprove something. And the third one, which is of interest to us, which is the notion of assurance, the QA. So if we really look smart assurance when we talk about, what we are probably doing is the ability to have the intersection of critical thinking, maybe coming up with interesting strategies driven by rational logic, and have some habits, and therefore that's the assurance part, right? And that is probably the nicest thing that we can look, just like great philosophy, what it is, right? So the intersection, the central part is what we probably want to have, inspired by philosophy, inspired by rationalism, driven by wonderful personal habits, so that we have a great assurance practice, right? And that's how I want to kind of set the tone, and then we can probably walk through some of the individual philosophers and what their key ideas were and how that could possibly relate to what we do. Before we do that, I'm going to just put out a small poll, which should come up on your screen in a minute. And it is just to kind of get your view in terms of saying, okay, what do you think is critical to QA? I mean, I put 4 of them. deep thinking and questioning, and it could be more than one. It could be all, it could be one, it could be two, it could be three. What do you think? Take a cup, take a few seconds, and then maybe you can click on them. I think it should show up on your screen. Is it deep thinking and questioning? Is it structured approaches? It's strategy, or is it breaking traditional habits? What do you think? Some of them said it's, questioning, deep thinking and questioning, and strategy and planning. Is there anything else that anybody else does things? It's your vote. Okay. So some people added to it, okay, it's about breaking habits too. Looks like not many people think that it involves logical structured approaches. Interesting. I'm not trying to say there's right or wrong, but I think, yeah, deep thinking and questioning seems to be something that a lot of people agree on, which is interesting for sure. And I think I totally agree with that entire logic. Okay. So let me get back to where we started. And therefore, let's talk about the first part. What do philosophers think? And if I were to put it in the context of thinking and questioning in QA. Socrates, one of the finest philosophers who lived, in Greek, and we have the notion of questioning called Socratic style of questioning, and Socrates reveled in conducting discussions at the town square, and all he did was to ask questions. So therefore, from Socrates, I think is really the art of probing. And he was always probing. He was always asking, what is truth, for example? And his famous statement is, an unexamined life is simply not worth living. So in a way, to me, Socrates, what I would like to look at from a learning aspect from Socrates, the philosopher, is the art of probing. So it's not about just checking a piece of software. It is actually going deeper than checking, to probe. And that's why I think all of us may agree that good testers really ask why before doing anything. Why do you want to do this? How does it work? And you ask that why question many, many times to understand, and therefore to probe deeper, and therefore find out if there are things that could possibly go wrong or cause expectations to be lossy. And therefore, if you put it in the context of smart assurance, it's really not about running something. It's not about just doing something. It is really about asking questions, which I'm quite sure a lot of us would possibly agree on. So from Socrates, to me, it's about probing. It's about moving from checking to probing, which is what really our methodology of high bestow subscribes to. So just a think question for you. Not that we need answers here per se, but just to kind of reflect a little bit. And the question here from a reflection standpoint is, okay, how often do you think people challenge requirements before testing? Do they take it and then look at finding out if it is meeting, or are they really saying, why? Why are we doing this? What does it mean? How does it benefit? Are they asking a lot of high questions? Just an act of reflection. It's not that I'm not trying to find the answers here. So moving from Socrates to his disciple Aristotle. And Aristotle, we know, was a great man in mathematics. And he had, of course, philosophy, mathematics. All these people were fairly, multifaceted, right? So his notion was there needs to be no extremes. We have to find the golden mean. That means what he was talking about is virtue is a mean between two extremes. That was his famous statement. And he just said, there's no point in being any extremes. We have to have a balance. And what does it mean to us? It simply means that we do just enough testing, not too much, not too little. We need to find that balance. For too little testing could mean missed defects. Too much testing could really mean wasted effort. And we all know balance is probably the hardest. It is the highest sense of knowledge. To be in the state of balance as a human is the hardest, right? To be able to accept and be always in a state of balance is the hardest. So in a way, moving from the life philosophy, so to speak, it simply says, are you doing too much? Are you doing too little? How do we know that we are? And that's the state of mind that we want to keep so that we are always in that harmonious balance. And therefore, the question to reflect on in this particular context of Aristotle, where we can think of it as the golden mean and QA as the takeaway, is, have you seen people over testing something? Maybe a feature, maybe a flow. Are we doing too much? And that's an interesting question to reflect on, because it helps us to understand, are we sometimes doing too much? Are we sometimes doing too less? The problem with too much in the context of testing is it eats up capacity, and therefore we're challenged with effort and time. We don't have as many resources, and therefore it's always a challenge of capacity. So that's, to me, the learning or takeaway from Aristotle. Being in the state of balance, to constantly be aware that we're not either doing too much or too little. So moving from the thinking and questioning and then going into the next stage in terms of saying, the notion of strategy and planning in the context of assurance, what can some philosophers teach us? And if you look, the Chinese philosopher, the author of a famous book called The Art of War, which if you have not read, it's a fascinating read. It's a thin book, but it's fairly densely packed. And Sun Tzu, he said, every battle is won before it's fought. He was a great proponent of strategy. So therefore, testing, if you were to kind of learn from Sun Tzu's Art of War, where he talked about every battle is won before it's fought, maybe we can put this in the context of smart assurance as testing really is an approach, a strategy, and it's not mere execution. Execution is fighting the battle in the forefront. And therefore, great testing is really about thinking ahead, figuring out various potential scenarios, some which have to be validated because that's how it's supposed to behave, some which are interesting that should never happen. And therefore, it's really about doing a lot of thinking to figure out the scenarios, the battle scenarios in his context, rather than running the tests mindfully, that is mindlessly, or fight the war. So it's the analogy that I put out here. It's just like saying, hey, maybe it's like a chessboard. You're thinking many moves ahead to figure out how you can win the game of chess. And in a way, the scenarios that we come is not just an act of writing. It's really about the strategic moves that we're thinking through to possibly uncover something interesting or possibly figure out potential loss of expectations and risk, therefore. So Sun Tzu simply said, think strategy, right? Think in terms of how you can plan better. Figure out all the moves in your head, right? That's really what Sun Tzu said. So therefore, the reflective question in this particular case is, how do you prioritize your strategy? I'm sure all of us have different ways to probably think along and answer this question. Somebody might say, oh, I use risk-based and so on and so forth. It's not about answering the question as much as how am I coming up with a strategy? How far ahead am I able to think ahead? How do I know? Where do I get in? So obviously you will probably relate to ideas of shift left also, because it's not about strategy after some requirement is written down or told. It probably is, code is written, but also about the early stage of formulation of certain ideas. So the idea here is, how do you prioritize? How do you plan ahead? And that's Sun Tzu. Confucius, another Chinese philosopher, who severely believed in the notion of success depends upon preparation, previous preparation. So he believed in the notion of it takes enormous amount of practice. It is about being very prepared, like the martial arts guy, what you see on the left, maybe the martial arts person who has to practice his moves quite a few tens of thousands of times so that when he actually gets into the war or fighting somebody else, it comes naturally. So treat, from Confucius to me, it is like, say, treat the entire act of QA as a discipline of habits. And therefore, the excellence, the notion of excellence in QA, it's not from external tools alone. It is to a large degree comes from the personal habits that each of us master. Therefore, consistency of practice of these habits lead to mastery. And that could be in terms of how I analyze the structure, how I take some notes, how I do refinement of ideas. I pay attention to the structure. When I say structure, organization of test assets, could be data, could be test cases, could be scripts, and could be whatever. So it's the orderliness in terms of structure, the ability to take notes, to be in the context, to refine, to adjust, to learn, to discard. All these are habits. And that's something that these are kind of as a part of the hybrid methodology, turns out to be what we call as key practices. Note taking, for one, is a key practice, which is is part of hybrid, which I think is probably to a large degree is what Confucius is primarily saying. Smart habits is really smart assurance. So if my habits were poor, it's quite unlikely that I might be able to smartly assure. I will certainly do a lot of grunt work, right? And therefore, I may not be as excellent as I would like to be. And therefore, Confucius, all he taught us was preparation. Preparation is key. Practice, therefore, is key. Results in great habits. And that's the result. Why? That's the reason it lends itself to excellence and smart assurance. So maybe you want to reflect on this particular question in terms of saying, what do you think people value, or what do you think you value as some of the important QA habit that you might want, or you might want your team members to have? I'm not saying there's just one. You may want to pick a few, but then the bottom line is, do you value certain habits as very critical and important for your team, for yourself as a member of assurance? Think about it. Going to the section on philosophers, which is kind of under the context of efficiency and minimalism. Why minimalism? Efficiency, we understand, I'm quite sure. We want to be as efficient as possible so that we can do the least amount of work, and we can do the optimal amount of work, use less amount of time, use less amount of resources. I think we understand. Why minimalism? Minimalism is the opposite of complexity, right? Having too much to too less. And having too less is a sense of, it simply means less complicated means the ability to do very well. And minimalism also means it's fundamentally very aesthetic. And ultimately, philosophers always looked at the notion of beauty, and aesthetics was also part of it. It was not just an act of doing. So let's examine what some philosophers could inspire us in the context of efficiency and minimalism. If some of you might have heard about this very famous gentleman, again, from the eastern side, Lao Tzu, the Zen. And one of his famous statements was, he's always in the notion of flow. He said, you should flow like water. And he always looked at the notion of do nothing and nothing will be left undone, was one of his statements. But one of his most powerful statements was, everything should flow like quiet water. It should be effortless. And therefore, he said that's the state of Zen for him. So Taoism or Taoism is what he subscribed to. So Lao Tzu, right? So what is the Zen of testing, therefore? It should be effortless. I mean, that's a very noble goal, and I'm sure every way when we are in an organization with deliverables and deadline and software and delays, it would be nice to say it should be effortless. But I'm sure you'll say, look, you are just being too philosophical. It's rough. What we really mean by the notion of testing should flow effortlessly is remove constantly any unnecessary effort. Focus on the essentials. So the idea that we can take away from Lao Tzu in terms of the Zen of testing is, I'm constantly asking, am I doing just right? Am I only focusing on the essentials? Am I doing anything possibly unnecessarily? And so that I can keep it as minimal as I can. And therefore I can be very sharp and pointed and good, right? And so it's the imagery is about, you should flow like a gentle river, not be blocked up like a dam, right? So there's no need for us to have a very rigid approach and just follow, but we must kind of flow, adapt, adjust. And that's the notion and idea of a flexible testing approach, which today we call agile, right? Agility to a large degree means respond. So water takes, it just flows. It takes the shape of a container. It takes the shape of the area it flows. It doesn't disrupt anything. And therefore, the notion of water is a very powerful idea of being effortless. So here, all we are saying is do as focus on the necessary and adapt as adjust and constantly adjust and adapt. That's the learning from, I would say, Lao Tzu, the Zen of testing. So the question to reflect on is, are we doing any unnecessary tasks? I'm sure some people might say, hey, maybe we could be a little optimal or a little less in what we possibly document for the future. I'm not saying documentation is bad or good. It's very contextual. But the idea of the reflective question is, do you think that you are overdoing some tasks? Could there be some removal, or could we tone it down? That's a question. Ask that. Now, I'm sure we all have studied geometry, and we know it's called Cartesian geometry. All credit goes to this wonderful mathematician philosopher, Descartes. And what do we take away from Descartes? Structured thinking, logical thinking. And it was one of his most famous statements that he says, I think, therefore I am. So it's a very deep statement. It's probably one of the statements that he made long years ago, and it's still very much used. In fact, there is a company in Bangalore which is named after the statement. If you know, the name of the company is called Itium. Of course, I think it was founded in the year 2000. They are a chip company, chip design. But I think, therefore I am is a very powerful statement from Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am, right? And therefore he believed in the idea of logical, structured thinking. And that's probably a very fundamental prerequisite to making the act of testing clearer and certainly more effective. The notion of science resulting in engineering is important. The notion of, for example, a structured design of somehow coming up with, let's say, test cases, vis-a-vis a little bit of a structure, an unstructured design to a structured kind of an idea where maybe there are some techniques that we use for a variety of jobs, be it design, be it estimation, be it automation, be it analysis. So he was a proponent of structured thinking, and what the takeaway here is, maybe logical structured thinking is necessary and important to be able to do well. And therefore, the act that we do, ask a question. And again, most of these questions are not a yes-no question, right? Do you prefer structured or ad hoc? I'm not saying this is good, because there'll be pros and cons for each one. But it's important to understand the balance. So you have to treat each of these philosophers as an interconnected piece, not as an individual piece. So if you say, yes, I prefer structured, and somebody would say, no, I think ad hoc is more creative. Both are right. But then I think from the Zen of testing, find the balance, right? So think of these various statements as meaningfully interconnected. Einstein, all he said was, never stop questioning. It's very important. And therefore, from Einstein's statement of never stop questioning is the power of curiosity that we value, especially in QA, where we are saying question everything, explore more, because we all believe that curiosity is necessary, very necessary for us to look for something hidden. And certainly, humans are curious. So quite obviously, machines and structured automation may not be able to easily mimic human exploration. But I guess with the systems that we have today in terms of Gen AI, it is interesting. They come pretty close, which means they are helping you be more curious, which is lovely actually. So the Einstein, it's about curiosity, right? Never stop question. We started with probing. Remember, we are only articulating it in the context of Einstein with saying power of curiosity. There we said checking to probing. Curiosity is a very in a very innate trait. It's hard to figure out. As kids, we are very curious. We are conditioned with people over time as we grow by parents and teachers and friends. So many shut up, don't ask silly questions. So we do over time lose a sense of curiosity, and suddenly we realize, my gosh, we need to think out of the box. We need to be curious, and how do I get that? That's the question. And lastly, the notion of challenging norms. There are two of them here. Take about 2 minutes. One of them is Nietzsche, a German philosopher, who simply said, he was in the philosophy, he was known as the existentialist. Existentialism was about everything that you see is true. So what is real is what is there. So that's why he made a famous statement: you must become who you are, right? And therefore, the takeaway from Nietzsche is break the traditional mindset. It needs innovation, not repetition. Rethink constantly how we do. Explore, don't just validate. So there might be practices that we might be following. Rethink, maybe you need to break them, right? So if you're doing fixed scripts and automation first and so on, maybe you want to really rethink some of those ideas. So all he said was, hey, from his takeaway is the need to constantly innovate, the need to break away from traditions, because you must become who you are, right? That's Nietzsche. And lastly, before we go into the last one of Nassim Taleb, ask yourself a question: are we still following certain practices which possibly are outdated? Is it just a question to reflect? Maybe it's time to find out if there are opportunities to remove some and replace with something more modern, interesting, meaningful, and be smarter. And last and the final section is on the failures and ethics. And we say failures, what can come to mind is possibly the book from Nassim Taleb. He's alive, lovely books he writes. Anti-fragility is his term. What he used from the notion of anti-fragile is learn from failures. He said some things benefit from shocks. It is important to shock things and make it fail. Why? Because it's not about making it fail. It is about learning from them. Therefore, at the end of the day, QA is not about, is about making software stronger. It's not just about finding bugs. It's about making it far more stronger, and therefore some of those failures we know teach us, and therefore we learn to prevent them, right? And that's what it is. So when we talk about testing, we're talking about perturbations. We're talking about irritating systems to make it fail. At the lowest level, we use simple notions of data. We give it bad data. We set up environments wrongly, and so on and so forth. Later, as the system becomes more and more full, as we start deploying in large, interconnected, distributed systems, how do you know systems can fail? Some of you might say, hey, I use failure mode and evaluation analysis as FME maybe as a technique from QC tools. Remember, there are ideas of chaos theory and chaos monkey as a tool from Netflix. All these are basically higher order perturbations at a system. So if you go look up chaos monkey on the net, you will find their entire open source tool available for creating perturbations at the highest level, where we go and irritate the system so deeply at the highest level, whose intention is to fail, and therefore now say, I wish I could, and then you say, I learned that this is not the way to deploy. This is how I should set up. This is how I should enable reliability, and so on and so forth. So Nassim Taleb, the whole idea was anti-fragile QA, learning from failures. And finally, before we go to the last philosopher, I'm sure Your answer should probably be a resounding yes. Do we treat failures as lessons or just problems? I'm quite sure all of you would say, hey, okay, failure is not just a problem, it is a serious lesson. And that's how we improve, whatever that we do, including testing. And lastly, more important in the age of AI, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who simply talked about ethics. And he's always talked about ethics as one of his famous statements as act in a way that your decision could be a universal rule. So if you're doing something as an action, Kant said it must be when you act, when you do something, ask yourself the question, would it be a universal rule? So if I come and beat you up, and that's my action, then I have to ask my question to understand if I'm ethical at beating you by asking, is that the universal rule? So would it be okay if somebody to beat me? And if the answer is yes, then it's ethical. So that's what he said, doing therefore the right thing. The notion of ethics and responsibility in the QA. So QA is not about just passing tests. It's really about the real quality. So ethical QA means we take the long form. We don't take the shortcut. And more so, I guess the word of ethics in the context of AI is more interesting because today we are questioning, is some of those things ethical? So I think some of those stuff is not any more technical. They're really asking more deeper questions. And Immanuel Kant was one of the forerunners in the context of ethics itself, in the context of philosophy. So what can we learn from here? Like one of my friends was telling me yesterday that she noticed in her team that tests were always passing, despite the fact that later she came to know there was actually a very major issue that was probably not uncovered, and slowly it would have become a big problem. And somebody kind of casually mentioned something, and then when she dug in later, she found out that people had tweaked the automation script to make it always pass. And then she would say, hey, this is not right. Why did you do? Of course, there was some apparently not unethical reason, but not necessarily the right reason. And she surmised that people were more interested in getting greens out of automation and making it pass, and therefore that was a grouse. And that kind of fits in so beautifully in this learning from Kant, which says, are we doing the right thing? Right? And the question therefore is, have you faced certain ethical challenges in QA and how do you handle it? It's again the last reflective question. So in conclusion, here is the mind map of all the people that we talked about, and we are done. Socrates, who taught us, who from the learning is the art of probing. The Aristotle, the learning is the balance, the golden mean. Sun Tzu, it's about strategy. It's about winning the war without fighting. Confucius, habits, practice. Lao Tzu, the Zen, the ability to flow like water. Descartes, logical structured thinking. Einstein, curiosity. Nietzsche, constantly break the mindset. Do innovate, don't repeat. Taleb, I guess we remember him, the notion of learning from failures, and Kant, ethics and responsibility. Hopefully, it was an interesting learning, interesting for you. I enjoyed putting together some of these content, something that I deeply love, the philosophy one side, testing another side. And question to you is, hey, which philosopher's approach probably resonates more with you? There's no one philosopher, I'm sure not. But yeah, with that, I conclude by saying thank you so much for listening.